What's a paranormal or unexplainable experience you've had? I'm going to try to explain this the best way I can. So I'm a skeptical person when it comes to paranormal stuff. I can always find logical explanations to most things that happen. I believe 15 out of 10 times when people report seeing things, it's just a case of apophenia. Anyway, this happened when I was about 10 years old. My dad had taken my brother, a couple friends, and me off-road go-karting in a small rural town in northern Mexico, about 40 miles south from where we lived. On our way back late at night, we came up to a red light at an intersection. On the opposite corner there was a cemetery on the left side of the road. While we were waiting at the red light, there was another car directly in front of us with their lights on. I remind you, this was late and dark in a rural town with dirt roads, also waiting, and another car who had the green light passed from right to left, lifting up a cloud of dirt. In that cloud of dirt that was left, with the car that was in front of us with his lights on, you could clearly see the silhouettes of what appeared to be an adult and two kids walking across the street in the opposite direction of the cemetery. The crazy thing about this is that all 6 of us in the car saw it happened. To this day I can't explain what happened or how it happened. I've asked my dad 18 years later if he remembers, and he does, but he also can't explain what it was. Not my experience, but one from someone I trust. Their story goes that they had some kind of creature try to trick him into letting it into his house. For some background, he lived with his parents and his home was in a pretty secluded, but nearish to the suburbs area at the time, and his mom was home with him and she was in the shower at the time of this occurrence. So the story goes that he was sitting in his room with the window open doing his regular relaxing thing when from outside the house he heard his mom call out from the outside asking him where he put the shirt he had borrowed from her. He didn't borrow such shirt, and he replied by saying as such. He thought it was weird that his mother was outside and asking about a shirt, but he wrote it off. He looked out his window and couldn't see his mother anywhere, so he got up and out of his room, realizing that the water was still running in his parents' shower. Weirded out, he went downstairs and called out for his mom, and her voice answered from behind the shut and locked front door. He says that her voice was very sweet and tender, using a tone that she would have used when he was little when she asked him, "Anonymous, please let me in." Anon isn't his real name, by the way. Just not going to use his real name. And then he says he heard the water shut off from the shower, as then the sounds of claws rolling down the front door could be heard, as the voice of his mother could be heard from behind the front door again asking to be let in. Followed immediately by a "Anon, I love you," with the sounds of claws rolling still being heard. He very quickly backed away from the door and went upstairs to retrieve his revolver, but as soon as he came back downstairs, the voice and the rolling claws were gone. No trace. No nothing of who or what it could possibly have been. One day during 4th grade, I didn't go outside for recess like I was supposed to. What can I say? It was hot and I was not an outdoorsy kid. I was inside, near the stairs to the 2nd floor. I started to hear music playing, and noted it was coming from the 2nd floor. I can't remember the song, but it sounded like an operatic choir of some kind. This hadn't happened before, so I went upstairs to investigate where the sound was coming from. When I get to the top of the stairs, there are 4 classrooms: the computer lab, the library, the art room, and the music room. I peek into each classroom first. No one is in any of them, and there is no evidence of a CD or cassette player. I look in the computer lab, and find nothing and no one. I go into the library, the music gets louder, but there's no one else around, and no visible music player. The art room is locked, but looking inside there doesn't seem to be anything in there that would be playing the music. I finally look in the music room, it's empty, and although the music is loudest here, there's nothing playing any music in the room. At this point I'm weirded out, and I go back downstairs and out the door. When the bell rings and I come back in with everyone, the music has stopped. This is a post elsewhere but a reply here. I was in 7th grade. I first learned of the supernatural through a Frank Edwards book. It started out with someone on their deathbed talking to deceased relatives and proceeded with about 20 more stories. I was freaked out a bit and talked with my mom, who told me that nothing was really proven and a few of the stories were probably made up to boot. In the following few years there were enough articles and even other books disputing all things paranormal, including a story or 2 I had read about. I became more skeptical. A few years later my grandmother died. We were 800 miles away and started making plans to join my dad, who had stayed with her in her last days. The night she died I was in my bed in a bedroom I shared with my 2 younger brothers when this happened. Our door was open to the hallway, which was lit but dim enough not to bother me, who was nearest to the door. I was laying in bed and ready to nod off when something I can only describe as a faint feather or leaf of light came floating into our room. To this day I'm still not sure what it was, and I'm not 100% my mind wasn't playing tricks on me, but I know I saw something. I am questioning it to myself all this time, but watching nonetheless. It floated into the room and paused at the foot of my bed for a few seconds. It did the same for my middle brother and then proceeded to my youngest brother, who was the farthest from the door. It paused at the foot of my youngest brother's bed for a second and then headed towards his head. It looked like it paused there and then was gone. I laid there thinking a few minutes and then kind of faded off somewhat offhandedly, thinking she had tucked him in. I never told anybody about it because I wasn't sure what I'd seen, or if, and nobody would believe me anyway, so I left it. About 40 years later I'm talking to my mom, and out of nowhere she says, "You do know that your grandmother visited your youngest brother on the night she died, don't you?" I was blown away and didn't even answer. I was just so stunned. My youngest brother and I were never close and never talked about anything. He had also moved about 700 miles east. We re-established contact about 2 years before he died and got on good terms. One night on the phone I asked him about it, and it turns out we had seen about the same thing. He described it as a feather of light too. I told him my version about how she stopped at the foot of each bed, but when it came to him how she had floated up to the head of his. I told him I thought she was tucking him in. He said, "Hell. I thought she was trying to smother me." It was our last huge laugh before life caught up with us both. I still question that night, but little bro was spot on with what happened. I am praying now that he can ask her in person and get back to me one day. I saw shadow people for a week on a farm my grandfather's brother owns. So yeah, I used to live in a kinda small town in Sweden, and my grandfather's brother has a farm there, only a sheep farm. Anyway, my second cousin I think it's called, and I had 2 pit bikes. Small dirt bikes, so we are driving around for a while just joking around. Suddenly I see things in the edge of my sight. But when I look, nothing is there. So I think maybe it's just a hallucination. Fast forward 5 hours and it's dark. We put back the dirt bikes as we head up to go to bed. I look out as the moonlight is lighting up a field, and I saw maybe 60 shadow things in the edges. I saw some come closer and closer, and in the end I started hearing branches and leaves. So I run inside, lock the door, and run up to his room to tell him something is in the front yard. He gets up, we both look. And there are drag lines in the gravel. Almost like someone just dragged their feet around. After that nothing happened. But in the morning we saw 4 pairs all leading around the house. I was so freaked out I got on my dirt bike and drove home. And well, thought I've seen ghosts and an alien looking at me through my window too. I was 10. So I'm no longer allowed to talk about paranormal things in my household, married, 23, and now have 4 dogs, because I've had quite a few things happen to me growing up. Well, on July 4, 2020 in Alaska, me, my wife, my buddy, and his wife decided to go to the hot springs and rent a cabin. While there, we came up on the subject of paranormal, and I explained the things that had happened to me previously. We laughed about it, and I started playing around later on in the restaurant they had there, like, if you're there flicker the lights, and weirdly enough one did flicker hard. Ignoring it, I seen a bird feeder out the window and decided on, if you're truly there, make this bird leave, thinking it would fly away eventually. Instead it got absolutely bodied by a much larger bird. Horrified, my wife decided that was enough from me. That night my buddy's wife had something tug her hair in her sleep and had seen something. My wife had something wake her up, but it was completely silent. After going home, our household there continued to have paranormal noises, and our 2 dogs at the time occasionally stopped and stared at the doorway with nothing there or where they were looking, and would growl and bark viciously. Like hairs standing on their backs, more than I've seen when they've actually fought each other. Also, something wouldn't let my wife sleep for 4 days straight by pushing on her legs when she was almost asleep and making noises in the hallways. I even talked about it at her friend's place, and soon after they had experienced paranormal things too. So consequently I've been banned from talking about these things out loud. Not really sure what to make of it, but sounds like a Ouija board is the last thing I should touch. I'm from a big family, and we are from a small town, country area. A farming family, somewhat relevant. Well, I had 2 great-great-grandmothers as a child. My great-great-grandmother on my father's side was called Grammy. Grammy lived in the house her late husband had built for her many decades earlier. Grammy was an incredible woman, independent until the day she died at 104 years of age. She made her own wine, from berries she grew and picked, and said wine was the key to a long life. She also said things like, "I used to listen to the wolves as a kid before they were exterminated in this area. You'll hear them here again by the time you're an adult, I just know it. I've seen it." Crazy thing is, she was right. She was ways right about that sort of stuff. That's not the weird part. Grammy and my great-grandmother, her daughter, claimed, not publicly, but to family, to be able to talk to spirits. Most people in the family brushed this off, but they would know things that seemed to be impossible to know unless they talked to the person. This was pre-internet, so it really caught people off guard. Okay, so now to the weird stuff. Grammy ended up in the nursing home due to a double hip break. She really took a turn for the worse that week. I was pretty young still, but I remember my dad, who worked ridiculously long hours, spending all his time he would have slept, keeping her company instead. One night he came home and said Grammy was in good spirits. I went to be a short while later. Now, I've always dreamed incredibly real, lucid dreams. That night I dreamed I was outside riding big wheels with my sister, bonus points if you remember big wheels. My dad's truck pulled into our very long country driveway at a very high rate of speed. He was beyond upset, saying Grammy had passed away just after he left the night before. I woke up feeling so confused. It seemed so real. Later that day my sister asked me to ride big wheels. All of a sudden my dad's truck pulls in, coming in hot. He jumped out of the truck and I could tell he'd been crying, something he just didn't do. He called us inside. Shortly later, he explained Grammy had passed away. I spoke up, saying, just after you left last night, right? My dad looked like he had seen a ghost. He couldn't understand how a small child knew that or would even guess that. To this day I've never told him about the dream. The thing is, my dream matched word for what my dad said, up to the point I said something so weird. A week later the family was going through the house. I lived writing at a young age, and my brother had gone down to the old basement to see a desk my Grammy used to write at. I went down there to find him, but all I saw through the dusty light provided by a small window was the desk. Half the room was lit poorly, the other half darker than night. As I was wondering where my brother was, a small toy tractor rolled out from the darkness. I recoiled in fear and said, "Brother's name, that's not funny." From the top of the stairs I heard my brother ask, "What's not funny?" I ran. I never entered that house again. Years later, I was 17. My great-grandfather, Dad's mother's father, was dying a horribly painful death due to extensive cancer. I went to see him one night, and he was no longer able to really talk. Everyone was hugging him, telling him they loved him as he was getting worse. When I hugged him, I said, "I love you, Grandpa." He whispered in my ear, "I love you too, my name." It sent chills down my spine, as he couldn't even remember his wife's name. I turned so white people asked if I needed to sit down. I just left, I couldn't understand what just happened. That night I dreamt of he and I sitting in my grandparents' house like we always did for get-togethers. He looked at me from his chair and said, "You know I'm dying, right?" I said, "No, Grandpa, the treatment worked. You'll be fine." He said, "No, my name, I'm dying as we speak." I woke up and sat straight up in bed sweating. It was around 2 a.m. That morning my dad wasn't gone for work, he was home. It wasn't normal. I was eating cereal at the dinner table when he walked up and grabbed my shoulder from behind. I glanced up and his face said everything. He looked down at me, said in a breaking voice, "He's gone, he passed about 2 this morning." Broke my heart. Over the next 2 years, my great-grandmother, Grammy's daughter, began to go downhill. I tried to visit when I could, but I lived almost 2 hours away. I remember the last time I saw her, I walked into her house expecting to see her in her kitchen. I could hear her talking to someone, it sounded like 2 distinctly different voices. One I recognized, being my great-grandmother, and the other, I couldn't place it. I didn't see any other cars I heard driveway, so I was super confused. I called out, "Hey Grandma." She said, "Come on in, I'm just talking to a friend." Confused I walked into the living room and saw, only my grandmother. No TV on, no radio, just her in her chair with a smile on her face. We began to talk and I said, "You must have been watching TV, or on the phone when I got here." "No, I was just talking to an old friend. I do that these days. I get lonely here so they visit." I kind of shook it off, and went to her basement to grab something. As I was down there I clearly heard her say, "Yeah, that's my grandson, he's so nice to visit. He's downstairs." Then I got the chills as I heard what clearly sounded like someone walking down the stairs. But no one was there. That's when my grandma, her daughter, explained that she and Grammy claimed to talk to spirits. I had seen and experienced enough weirdness over the years to start to believe it. A few months later I had one of those dreams. This time, it was my great-grandma. Back in her living room, but this time when I walked into the living room, I saw them. I saw the people she was talking to. They all seemed so happy, no one seemed to even acknowledge me being there. They were saying they were so happy to see her again. It freaked me out. The next day I got a call from my dad. I could tell he was shaky. He said, "Great-grandma passed away." I asked how. She was a larger woman, and she was getting an EMS-assisted lift to go to the hospital. They dropped her. Her heart stopped and they couldn't get her to come back. It was a horrible accident, but it was her time. It clicked in my head that the reason she could see them in the dream was because she was also dead. They were no longer voices of old friends, but they were really there. Thinking about it still makes me feel weird. If you read this far, good on you. Those are just a few unexplained events in my life.